Hello and welcome to Undivided. I'm Brandi Kruse. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. Undivided is presented by the founding sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. You can visit them at 1530mortgage.com. A lot to get to today. Of course, it's Fridays with Friends. We're going to check in with my friend Allie Bradley, an independent journalist who's been covering immigration at the southern border. In fact, she is in Texas today. We will also have Florida Report with my sister Miranda checking in on what's happening in a state different from Washington in so many ways. In fact, they have an interesting holiday that is being celebrated in the state of Florida this week. And no, it's not the 4th of July, but it might be just as good. Also coming up today, we're going to be starting a new segment that I hope will help people get to know and learn the history of the American experiment a little bit better. So it's something we're going to start doing every Friday as well. But we start today by talking about COVID-19, because apparently we're still doing this. Yesterday, very surreptitiously, quietly, with no fanfare, Washington Governor Jay Inslee put out a brand new directive, and it has to do with state workers and COVID-19 vaccines. Now, we've been waiting to find out what the governor is going to do with the mandate that state workers get a vaccine. It was a mandate he issued under his emergency powers, which the state is still in a quote-unquote state of emergency. And so we've been waiting to see, okay, is the governor going to lift that mandate for state workers? Well, the governor issued Directive 22-13, which again came out very quietly. There was no press release or anything that accompanied it. And the governor announced that it will now be a permanent condition of employment for state workers to not only have a COVID-19 vaccine, but to be up to date with any boosters that might be required or recommended, rather, by the CDC. So this new directive applies to state executive and small cabinet agency employees. So basically, for state workers who work for independently elected officials like the Attorney General's office, the Secretary of State, those independently elected officials are going to decide whether this is also going to be required for their employees. But for the state workers that are covered in this directive, all new employees, as a condition of employment, must be vaccinated against COVID-19 with the most up-to-date vaccination, including any additional doses or boosters as recommended by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It will also be a requirement for current employees as well to be up-to-date on vaccines and to be boosted if recommended by the CDC. Obviously, if you're in a union, some of these things are going to have to be bargained. And then the governor ending this by saying, I recognize the difficulties of implementing this directive to maintain the health and reduce the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on our state workers. I call upon our higher education institutions, boards and commissions, and other separately elected officials to consider similar requirements within their agencies and jurisdictions. The governor saying this is to address the continuing threat and ensure the health of our workforce. Look. I really can't believe that we're still doing this. This directive is coming from a governor who is fully vaccinated and boosted, yet just got COVID-19. We have long ago established that having the vaccine, having necessary boosters does not prevent you from getting COVID-19, does not prevent you from spreading COVID-19. There has been some strong reaction to this. The Libertarian Party of Washington says Governor Inslee is obviously exploiting COVID-19 as a political purge. COVID-19 vax policies should be seen as nothing else going forward. These policies have nothing to do with health. And I've seen a lot of responses in this regard, basically saying that this is the governor trying to purge like Republicans from working in state government or in state positions. J.T. Wilcox, of course, the ranking Republican in the State House of Representatives, responded to this saying, you might be okay with this, but a governor who will dictate endless boosters for employees will feel little hesitation for future incursions into your affairs. And I think that's the thing. How many boosters have already been recommended? And the governor is talking about this as a permanent thing where you have to be up to date on what the CDC recommends for boosters. Well, there are multiple articles from mainstream news publications. Here's NBC saying that COVID booster effectiveness wanes after 4 months. So again, is the governor going to mandate that you have to go to a doctor every 4 months and get a COVID vaccine booster if that's what the CDC recommends? So is that going to be until the end of time, that every 4 months, in order to stay employed with the state, you have to go get a COVID vaccine booster that's not going to prevent you from getting COVID-19, that's not going to prevent you from spreading COVID-19. Yeah, it might prevent you from getting seriously sick, but we know that the number of people who get seriously sick and die from COVID is declining by the day. How far are people willing to let the governor take this? And you might say, well, what do you mean by that, Brandi? What are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? I mean, there's not an election until 2024. There's not going to be a new governor until 2024. And you might have Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who's just going to implement the same policy anyway. Well, what you can do is refuse en masse. They cannot fire every state worker. They cannot afford to fire 20% of state workers or 30% of state workers. And I think that if there is a widespread refusal at this juncture to abide by this, and I hate to be the one to say that. I mean, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do with their health or their bodies. If you want a COVID booster, get a COVID booster. I mean, that's up to you entirely. But to submit to the government in this case, that, yeah, I'm going to get a COVID booster every 4 months or whatever the CDC recommends. Every 4 months, what, for the rest of your life, for the rest of your employment? Are you okay with the government tracking that, with the government mandating that, when it's not going to stop you from getting sick, when it's not going to stop you from getting other people sick? Where does it end? It is truly bordering on the absurd at this point. I had really hoped that the governor would say, you know what, we're really out of this emergency situation. We're going to leave it to people to decide whether they want to continue to get boosted for COVID-19 or not. You know, especially after, again, I go back to the obvious, undeniable ramifications that the vaccine mandate had on people all over the state. You know, not being able to get from the islands to the mainland because there wasn't ferry service, not being able to get across the mountain passes because there weren't enough plow truck drivers to plow the roadways. You know, cities that were already suffering for police staffing in the middle of a public safety crisis that had officers who were terminated, firefighters who were terminated over the vaccine requirements. I don't know if I'm alone on this island, but to think that the governor is willing to continue to accept all the consequences of this requirement at this juncture in the pandemic, it is almost unbelievable to me. I mean, we are way past the point of overreach when it comes to Governor Jay Inslee and these decisions that he's been making during the pandemic. And gosh, we're 2 years. We still have 2 years until he's, I assume he's not going to run for governor again. He'll probably try to run for president again. We're 850 days into a state of emergency. He's still leveraging his emergency powers when many, many states have not found that necessary. And I just go back to the fact that this pandemic has been so rapidly changing. There's been different strains that the vaccines have different effectiveness toward. And where are we going to be in a year or 2 years? You know, to say that people can't come work for the state when we desperately need to fill positions if they don't have a COVID-19 vaccine, and then a year from now it could be completely irrelevant. Or you have somebody who's worked for the state for 20 years and they don't want to get a booster because they're healthy and they're not getting sick. And to say, oh, well, you can't work with us anymore. You can't work for the state anymore. And to totally derail their entire career over something that, again, is nearing the point of irrelevancy. This is the definition of government overreach. And to drop this decree, you know, very quietly and on 4th of July weekend, nonetheless, when we're talking about our freedoms and celebrating our liberty, and the governor's like, no, you're going to lose your job if you don't submit to vaccine boosters every 4 months or whatever the CDC wants. I really think it's time to try to do what's within our power as citizens, what's legal and what's, you know, I have no extreme reactions to this or anything, to try to put the governor in check and say, no, we're not going to continue down this road. We're not going to continue down this road of government overreach. I tend to believe that the most effective way to do that is just to have en masse a refusal to, I mean, not necessarily get the booster. You might want the booster, but that doesn't mean you can't refuse to submit to the government that you're getting this booster as often as it's required by the CDC. I do wonder if there's anybody out there who's coming around to this, who has agreed with everything the governor's done, but who just thinks that this mandate in perpetuity goes too far. I'd be curious in hearing from you. tips.undivided@gmail.com. There is an interesting proposal being considered in King County, Washington, which, if you're not familiar, Seattle is the seat of King County. What they want to do is they're trying to move off-year elections to the even years. So obviously the big elections happen on even years. This year you've got the midterm elections in 2024, a new governor, president, all that stuff. And so obviously you have higher voter turnout on the even years than you do the odd years. And the odd year elections tend to be kind of small races, maybe some ballot measures and taxes and things like that. And so what they find is that you have, I mean, just as an example, in 2020, 85% of voters in King County cast ballots in the 2020 election. Not surprising, presidential election year, that's pretty good turnout. And then fast forward to 2021, that dropped to 43%. So almost cut in half in an off-year election. And so the argument from the King County Council is, hey, let's just put everything on even years, and then you have more people participating in the process when it comes to these hyper-local elections and ballot issues. Now, some Republicans are crying foul with this because they believe that this will set Democrats up to win basically everything. And this is an argument that I find absolutely hysterical. So I'll read this quote. This is in Crosscut from Reagan Dunn. He's a Republican. He's a member of the King County Council, doesn't like this idea. He's also running for Congress in the 8th Congressional District. And Reagan, if you're watching, I got to pepper you on this one a little bit. So he has a couple arguments that he details to Crosscut. He thinks that moving these elections to an even year would result in local issues sort of being buried, very secondary as opposed to being the focus. He said the local issues are likely to be lost, things like crime, homelessness, and land use. Those things will be buried. But he also just blatantly acknowledges that moving these elections to even years will hurt the Republican Party. He said, I think it hurts ever so subtly the Republican Party's chances of winning local office. So basically, what he's saying and what some Republicans believe, I think a lot of them just don't say it out loud, is that the more people who vote, the less likely they are to win. That cannot be your argument. That cannot be your argument for this, because that is a losing argument. If your argument is, yeah, but if more people vote, we're not going to win, I can't think of a shittier argument than that. You should be winning on the merits of your campaigns, on the merits of your argument against ballot measures, etc. If you can't convince the majority of voters that you're the best candidate or you have the best ideas, then I hate to break it to you, but that's sort of how elections work. So as this topic is discussed and debated, and look, I do get there's a couple things I understand about opposition to this. One, you shouldn't have to force or shoehorn people into voting. People who care will come out to vote, even if it's an off-year election. And so, the idea of, well, we got to slip these things in on a presidential election year or we'll never get people out to the ballot. You shouldn't have to force people to vote. If they want to vote, if they want to be part of these decisions in off years, if they want to be part of voting on local, hyper-local elections and issues, then they can do that. I mean, you shouldn't have to force them or incentivize them to participate in the process. So that's one thing I don't love about this, is sort of giving lazy voters a pass. And then I understand the concern about hyper-local elections being lost in bigger elections. As a member of the press, for off-year elections, you're able to focus your time and energy on covering these really important local issues where if you throw them on the same ballot and in the same election as president and governor and Congress and all of that, those local issues aren't really going to get as much attention or as much coverage. So I think those are valid conversations to have. But for the love of God, Republicans, if your argument is that if more people vote, we will lose, that is a terrible, terrible, terrible argument. And please find a better argument to use. It's Friday. That means it's Friday with Friends, where I bring in an interesting friend of mine to talk about news and all sorts of stuff. Joining us today is my friend, independent journalist Ali Bradley, live from Del Rio, Texas. Is that right?
Oh yeah, the second home these days, Brandi. I'm like an honorary Texan at this point, I think.
Yeah, you've been down there quite a bit, and I just love the Texas vibe you have. The big hair, the humidity looks good on you. Yeah, you look happy in the heat.
Thanks. You don't hear that very often. The humidity looks good on you, girl. Like I will wear that badge of honor. I don't know how my hair has handled this humidity, but it does. It does. I go out in Washington in 1 second, my hair is stick straight. But here, girl, we're living the dream. We're living our Dolly Parton life over here.
No, yeah. When I was with Fox 13 still, I went down to the border one time, and that was during the quote unquote kids in cages fiasco. And I was outside on live shot for like 30 seconds, and I looked like pure trash. So you're doing it well.
Thank
But
you.
I wanted to, in all seriousness, I know Fridays with Friends is supposed to be kind of fun, chat about you, chat about what you're doing, but you've been doing some really sad stuff, unfortunately. Last time we had you on the show, you were at the scene of the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, covering that. We're going to talk in a moment about some of the really tragic events that have been happening with migrants along the southern border. I guess I'm curious, and I'm sure people who are listening are curious, how you internalize that, or how you deal, or do you internalize it, or how you deal with sort of the sadness and the stress of all that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as journalists, a lot of us, this will probably resonate with a lot of journalists. We just have this level of desensitization, and same with first responders. They deal with a lot of the similar things that we do. I remember when I was working in Seattle, and I sat down with our news director, and I had to ask her how do I separate myself from this? Because every day I was doing stories about death and somebody losing a loved one, and it was just devastating. And I do feel that I am low key a little bit of an empath, so I feel what people feel. And I always say I can meet them exactly where they are. And that does take a toll. But I think what I've kind of managed to do, and this probably isn't PC or appropriate for a journalist to do, I do make it a little bit personal sometimes. I make connections with these people and I follow up with them, and they become somebody who I know and somebody who I can follow up with. And it isn't just like exploiting them for the sake of getting the tears on the TV and then walking away. I get to know them. And so to me, that feels my soul a little bit too. It kind of gives me something back versus me just taking from them. You know what I mean? So I figured out a way to kind of make it personal. I know that's against the rules. We're not supposed to do that, but I think I've been able to separate myself enough in my stories. But in my personal life, I do have connections with most of the people that I tell stories about.
I actually think that's a good quality in a journalist. I mean, I have encountered journalists in Seattle who've been around for a long time who are like emotionless, who I hear them talk to families of crime victims, and I'm like, that person just lost a loved one. You know, how could you be so cold and callous? And so I think it's just human to feel something. I mean, you still have to be able to do your job and tell the story, but to let it like touch you in that way, I mean, I think is important to really understanding the gravity of it.
I think it's interesting that you brought that up about people being callous, because when I interviewed the grandfather in Uvalde, a lot of people were frustrated with the way I conducted the interview. And what a lot of people don't understand, Brandi, is the dynamic there, where most Southern Texas men, and especially Latino men, they don't radiate emotion. They aren't going to sit there and spill their guts and to just start crying and be, this puddle that everybody kind of expected him to be. And so I met him where he was. Because I talked to him exactly how he talked to me, we were able to talk for over an hour. We did cry at the end and we did pray at the end together. But during the interview, people were frustrated and they didn't think that I was emotional enough and kind of empathetic enough to him. But it was exactly where he was. And the energy matched. And so if you were in that room, it would have been a different story, I think.
Yeah, it's the same way if you've got a family member of a victim who is beside themselves with grief, and if you approach them just stone cold with no empathy, one, it's not right, but two, you're not going to be able to elicit anything from them as a journalist. So you're right, you really do have to kind of read the room and approach people where they are, as you put it. Speaking about Uvalde, last time we spoke, it was really before we knew the full extent of how poor the police response was. And I think both of us were in a place of giving police the benefit of the doubt because I mean, that's just sort of how I operate. I don't put myself in dangerous situations, and so unless I know otherwise, I'm past the point of the benefit of the doubt. I'm really disgusted by what's come out. You're very linked in with the law enforcement community there. You have good sources. How is the law enforcement community feeling about, I think, the national disgust over the police response in that incident?
It's interesting because it's still a mix. I talked to some of my border patrol sources and they still, are kind of saying that that is the information that they knew and that they had to go off of at that time. Obviously, we know that the commander on the ground, Chief Arredondo, he didn't make very great decisions. And we see the whole timeline and your brains are scrambled eggs when you look at that and you're trying to figure out how that was a decision that was made. And you're trying to figure out, why did the sheriff step in? They were there. Sheriff Nolasco was there with deputies. Texas DPS was there. So it's kind of hard not to look at it in any other way that they needed a fall guy. Most of the damage was done in minutes, Brandi. So by the time a lot of these other agencies got there, I think they just kept their hands off and kind of let him take the brunt of it. And that's what we're seeing right now is really, Arredondo is kind of the one that's going to fall on the sword here. I mean, if he ever kind of surfaces and really shares more than what he did with the Texas Tribune.
So you have some law enforcement sources who are still kind of defensive of the way that things happen. Do you have law enforcement sources who are not, who are like I said, disgusted by it? Or
yeah. So one of my other sources has a child that was in the school. Thank God it was a third grader. So he was not in the building, but he was outside on the playground and witnessed the shooter outside and was ushered back into these classrooms that were not his with classmates that were not his. I mean, devastating, right? And so this family, when I was with them, they didn't change their clothing for 5 days, Brandi. They were not even surviving. They were just existing. And that dad, the dad there, that agent, he is disgusted with the way that this all went down. He still can't process how this happened, how they weren't there to get into those rooms quicker, why they waited for these things. They learned that they used a hooligan, which is basically a crowbar to get in. And he's just, I mean, he was like, how? So yeah, there are certainly law enforcement individuals that can't even wrap their head around the response at all, not even in the slightest.
yeah, you spent a lot of time in that community. I know it's pretty close knit. How do you even begin to rebuild trust between the police department and law enforcement there and the people that they serve?
I don't even know. Honestly, I mean, I would probably start with new leadership in that regard. I mean, I wouldn't say that, get rid of Pete Arredondo. That's not my job to say that, but it would probably start with kind of changing up the guard a little bit, because you can't just keep things the same and expect change or expect people to rally around. You have to make some kind of change. And even if you're going to keep the same people in place, but you're going to put out different policies, or you're going to really loop in the community about what you're doing moving forward, I think that's the only way. I mean, they are demolishing that school, right? So that's one step in rebuilding in the community. But what are they doing on the police response side? What is the sheriff doing to make sure that the community feels safe? That when they hear the sirens, it's not, one of their children that's in danger. I mean, when you're in that town, Brandi, and an aid car drives by, you can hear a pin drop. Outside of the sirens, everybody stops everything that they're doing. It's still so devastating and traumatic in that community right now.
Yeah. And you kind of went from one terrible incident to another. There was this story. I mean, this is a tough one too. This is from Yahoo. Authorities arrest man accused of operating abandoned truck where 53 migrants died. First of all, do we know how these migrants died? Was it just the heat? They were abandoned in the truck, or?
Combination of things. So this truck was refrigerated. It was supposed to be, but there was no sign of a working AC unit in there. So a lot of people died from asphyxiation. A lot of them died from heat stroke and heat exhaustion. And the law enforcement individuals said when they were working on these people and they were transporting them, they were hot to the touch. And it was triple digits. And it has been down here in Texas. I mean, that is unfathomable conditions, Brandi. I mean, I can't even think, can't even wrap my head around what they must have went through and what their final moments were. I mean, that is absolutely terrifying, absolutely devastating. And then to know that this truck went through a checkpoint, but they didn't check it, because they don't check every commercial vehicle because they can't. They don't have the manpower to do it. And it would, back up traffic for miles because the semi trucks go through basically the same place that the cars go through. And so what are they going to do? Governor Abbott just said that he's going to start more checkpoints immediately. So they're going to have more truck checkpoints going on, but this was preventable. This truck went through a federal checkpoint.
Yeah, and you got men, women, children, just devastating. And it shows you that these people who, are smuggling human beings, apparently the guy who was arrested was high out of his mind on meth when they found him. No care or concern they just want the money or whatever they're going to give him to get him across. And then no care or concern for whether they live or die once they're here.
And that's what law enforcement and Border Patrol are constantly saying and constantly urging the migrants to hear is that do not put your lives in the hands of these transnational criminal organizations because they don't care. Once they get the money, they don't care. That guy had the money already. He did his job. It didn't matter if they got to point Z. He picked him up at point A, and that was his job. So, and that's what we're seeing. And you see these pursuits ensue. Brandi, right now, and I have not even put this anywhere. I just got this from a source. 500 migrants have died this fiscal year. 500. I do not know if that includes a 53, but 500. And that's what we're looking at. I mean, we had 7 within the last 24 hours I posted about it yesterday. This is it's already out of control. It's been out of control. That's why I've been down here for almost a year. But with this heat and with the elements that we're going into, it's going to get worse. Someone has to do something.
Yeah, and there was just, as you said, there was the 4 migrants who were killed in a crash in the vehicle that they were being smuggled in. You've been down at the Rio Grande for drownings that have happened. You got people who died just from the conditions, people who die in trucks, being smuggled in. And I think to me what it says and what it should say to every single person in power is there is no safe way to come into this country illegally. There just isn't. And so you have to understand, and I know you appreciate the desperation that these people must be going through, but I guess for officials in Texas who are left to deal with the really tragic aftermath of incidents like this, what is their sentiment like right now towards the federal government, who's not doing more to make it difficult for people to come here illegally?
Well, for lack of a better word, they're pissed off, Brandi, because this is their job. It's not only to secure the border, but it's to preserve lives. They're literally up against a wall right now. They don't have the manpower to be out there. I don't know how many bodies are probably strewn about in ranch lands that were abandoned, because if you're vulnerable, if you're elderly, if you're a woman, you're a child, if you twist your ankle, break a toe while you're out there with your group being smuggled through the ranch lands, they're gonna leave you. You're gonna die. And how many bodies are out there? So these Border Patrol agents are angry. I spent 4.5 hours out there with a tracking team. We could not find the woman whose pin drop we had. And we came to the categorical conclusion that it was a distraction. So not only are they out there on this humanitarian effort trying to help, but they're being messed with by the coyote and the cartels too. They're getting fake locations. Like, hey, go out here. This is where we left them yesterday. And then you go out there and you spend 4 hours looking for them. When you have 2 deputies, what does that mean? That means that there's a lot of unopened or unmanned areas, a lot of areas that are opportunities for these cartel, for these coyotes, for these human smugglers. So they're frustrated because they're not able to do their job. They haven't been able to do their job, they tell me, for a year or more, obviously at this point. But now we've had all these deaths and they're frustrated because they're preventable deaths. I just went to a Dangers of Crossing the Border media event in El Paso, and they were talking about it. They were saying, do not come into the country between the ports of entry. Come across in the port of entry. Come legally. Don't put your lives in the hands of these smugglers. Come across legally. People will help you. People will be here to receive you. But they're not doing that. And they're ending up dying. And they're ending up being smuggled in the trunks of cars. I mean, we're going to have more deaths. We've seen people in crates, Brandi, that are nailed shut, that they've had to open up with crowbars, with people inside. I mean, it's really, really hard to wrap your head around. Well, we have
Well, I would say for Democrats, I mean, and I don't want to lump all the Democrats in, but they talk about, they are not willing to talk about this as a public safety crisis. Because when I think public safety crisis, I also think for the people who are coming across. It's not humane to have an open southern border. I mean, look at what it's leading to. And I guess I wish that that would sink in more.
Well, it's just, it can't be about humanity, Brandi. And I've said this before, because if it were about humanity, then there would be people up along the ports of entry protesting. There would be people up there ushering these folks in to walk across. They would be mandating, they would be requiring that that happens instead of being put in the hands of these smugglers to be forced to cross the river with children when the Amistad Dam is out and the river's higher than normal and they're getting swept away. I mean, if this were about humanity, there would be an actual way that these people are able to cross if they legitimately are seeking asylum. But they get a ticket at the port of entry and then they get kicked back into Mexico if they cross at, a legitimate crossing. And a lot of these migrants are now being killed off by rival gangs because it's more lucrative. Bodies are lucrative, not drugs. You can reuse people and you can keep getting money out of them, but drugs are once. So now we've got rival gangs over in Mexico that are killing each other's migrants. So they don't want to go back to Mexico. So if this were about humanity, the administration would be doing something about this. They would be requiring Border Patrol and other agencies to allow these people to walk across and to claim asylum on this side by walking instead of by going into the hands of these smugglers and owing them hundreds of thousands of dollars at this point.
Yeah, illegal immigration needs to be tougher. Legal immigration still needs to be vetted, but it needs to be not marred in red tape, which so much government stuff is. And I'm saying this as, I know this is not your opinion, but we have such a social safety net in states like Washington for people who are here and who are undocumented. COVID money during the coronavirus pandemic, and I just can't help but think, I don't mind taking care of human beings, but you're not making it, you're incentivizing people coming here illegally, which, right, as we know, is dangerous. And that just can't be where we're at as a country.
Well, and Brandi, I just talked to, and I posted it online as well. This is something new that we have not seen a lot of since I've been covering the southern border. People are openly talking about wanting to be here to work now, not asylum. They're openly saying, I'm not claiming asylum. I just want to be here to work. And that is different. Not saying that we shouldn't have workers coming in here, but it's different because they've never admitted it, because they know that that's not an asylum claim. So it's really interesting. It's kind of brazen, if you will, that I have 4 single adult men saying, no, I'm here to work. And that's what we're dealing with, and then we have law enforcement that are taking matters into their own hands. I told you about how Sheriff Coe in Kinney County, they had a smuggling pursuit happen, and there were 3 other pursuits going on at the same time. 4 migrants were in this person, 5 total. 1 was transported to the hospital. 4 refused medical care. Well, Border Patrol refused to take them because they have to be cleared by the ER department if they are involved in an accident, because what if they have internal injuries? Border Patrol said, we're not taking them. Well, Kinney County Sheriff only has a few deputies. So his deputy would have had to sit at the hospital for 7+ hours, the sheriff says, because these people wouldn't have been priority. They don't have the manpower to have them sit there. So he had his deputy load up the 4 people and take them to the port of entry and drop them off and kind of point in the direction of Mexico and allow them to go to Mexico. I mean, if they really wanted to, they could have turned right back around and walked back into the US, but I think they were probably a little shocked that happened. But now the ACLU is going after the sheriff. There's all these legalities here, but it's such a gray area, Brandi. This has never happened before. And he believes he's within his constitutional right to protect his citizens, because these people were not self-surrendering. They were evading law enforcement. They were being smuggled into the interior of our country. And so he believes that was his only option. So, I mean, it's like the Wild West out here right now.
Yeah, that's wild. The sheriff just bringing people right back to the border. I mean, that's not usually how things operate, but I can't say that I blame the guy for just saying, you know what, I'm fed up with this.
He didn't cross over the border. He brought him to the port of entry and basically said, do what you will, but you're not going to do it in the middle of my town.
Yeah. Well, Allie, let's end with this. I always just appreciate all your insight. It's just been fascinating to watch what you've done and just grabbing hold of the border issue and doing some really, really great work. Do you plan to continue to cover the border kind of for the foreseeable future?
Yeah. People have asked me, when is your job done at the border? When are you done? Because in August, it will be a full year where I've come down at least once a month. I've done something border related. The 1 month exception was when I went down and walked with the caravan. But I'll say that my job at the border will be done when the pendulum doesn't swing so aggressively. When in between administrations, we kind of have this little teetering. We know policies are going to change, but right now, everything that President Trump did has been undone. And all those policies weren't necessarily wrong. Some of them, like biometrics for children under 14, that makes sense to most people. Claiming asylum in the first place that you're safe and can make a life. A lot of people agree with those things. But because it was the administration that this current administration wildly disagrees with, the pendulum is aggressively swinging to the left, to the right, and back and forth. And this political football just keeps getting hiked in between the goalposts, right? And we're never, ever winning. No, neither side is ever going to win until we can come to this agreement that what's best for America and what's best for these migrants as well, and what's humane, and the policies kind of just teeter. That's when, I think I'll be done covering it. I think even if I moved to a completely different country, I would still have a pulse on the border because of the sources that I've cultivated and the trust that I've really cultivated with these people. I get messages every day. Like I said, I just learned that 500 migrants have died this fiscal year from a source that's within DHS. And I'm honored to have those sources and to be a voice for the ones that don't have a voice. They have a gag order on them. They literally cannot talk. And what's cool, Brandi, though, is while I have law enforcement sources, I have amazing migrant sources too. I get to talk to Victor still all the time, who's down in El Salvador. He was in my caravan carrying the flag. I get to talk to the family of Venezuelans who are in Oklahoma City. They're doing well. They are working, albeit under the table because they have to. I get to talk to a lot of them as well. But their protections are a little bit different because they're trying to live their life right now. And I'm trying to respect that as well. And not air out what they're trying to do. The government has a hold on what they're doing. And so I'm not trying to make their life harder because I know it can't be an easy one right now.
Yeah, well, I think you said something there that speaks to the heart of this show. This idea of when the pendulum just keeps swinging to the far extremes, and that goes for not only the border, but a variety of issues. America, you can't function like that every 4 years with such vastly different policy prescriptions. So, Allie Bradley from Texas, thank you again for joining us and for enlightening us and for being on Friday with Friends.
Thank you, Brandi. I am honored to be your friend and to call you a friend. Thank you for having me.
It's Friday. That means it's time to check in on what's happening in the Sunshine State. It's our segment, Florida Report.
It's not even controversial anymore.
People know in Florida their freedoms are going to be respected.
And we bring in our Florida correspondent, nepotism at its finest, my sister Miranda. You look so news lady today.
Thank you. I'm just trying to keep up with you.
Well, I'm kind of bummed you have your hair up because I was getting such vibes and everybody was complimenting your hair on my social media. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do a middle part now instead of a side part. And I took that inspiration from you, and now you have a ponytail.
I know. It's really hot in Florida these days, so the humidity's got me in a hair bun probably for the next 5 months.
Okay, good to know. All right, it's hot in Florida, but it's also free in Florida. What's the first story you have for us today?
Our first story we have today is clickorlando.com, Florida's Freedom Week. Here's a list of what to buy tax-free. Basically, Freedom Week is a tax-free week that DeSantis kind of wrote into power last year. And from today until the 7th, there's all types of things you can buy to enjoy your summer tax-free. And those things include and are not limited to event tickets to certain events like concerts. And they don't have to happen this week. As long as you buy the tickets this week, they could be in December, but you can get tax breaks on those. You can also get tax breaks on fishing gear and supplies, as well as water sports gear. There's dollar limits to the amount you can get tax breaks on, but it's kind of a fun little week to go out and stock up on all your favorite summer gear. And
man, Ron DeSantis does it again.
He does. I'm telling you, he kind of knows how to play to his crowd.
Yeah, anytime that you let people keep more of their money, they're going to like you. Meanwhile, that's not happening here in Washington State.
Oh,
no.
You need Washington Freedom Week.
All right. You would not be free if you got trapped in a giant hole on the beach. Bring us to the next story out of Florida.
TikTok trend encouraging giant holes on Florida beaches. A new trend on the popular social media platform TikTok is creating a big problem at beaches across Southwest Florida. According to reports, some beachgoers are digging giant holes in the sand and leaving them without filling them in. And some of these holes, they say, are reported as big as 5 feet wide and 5 feet deep, even in some places. So that's fairly dangerous.
Well, I have firsthand experience with this. So I was in South Padre, Texas for a bachelorette party not too long ago. And, kids play in the sand and they dig holes and build things or whatever, and that's fine. But then when the water would come up, it would cover the holes, and then you would just be walking in shallow water, and all of a sudden it'd be like, "Bah!" And you'd just twist your ankle.
I didn't even think about the tide coming in and filling them in and making them just completely invisible. I just think about you just trying to enjoy your life on the beach, looking out at the horizon and just falling into a giant hole. I just think it's...
No, it's dangerous. Imagine you're waiting and then all of a sudden you just fall into a 5-foot hole.
Yeah, so it basically is just saying, because there's no laws against it. You can have all the digging exercise and fun you want at the beach in that regard, but they are just asking you to fill them in and leave only footprints is the advice of wildlife officials about this.
Yeah, and if there's any kids, there'll be a lot of people at the beach this weekend. So just think about what if there's a little toddler who's walking in the water with his mom and then falls into one of your holes. So just fill it in, okay, kiddos?
That's one of the points they actually make, is that there's a lot of families and it's just not safe for them if they're not the ones digging the holes themselves.
Yeah, not cool. Okay, you have a Florida man story for us?
I do have a Florida man story. Florida man, this is a Fox 35 Orlando. Florida man poses as Disney World cast member, steals $10,000 R2-D2 droid, deputies say. A Central Florida man was arrested after deputies said he posed as a Walt Disney World cast member and took a Star Wars R2-D2 droid in the hopes that Disney's security would hire him.
Now, do you think that was just an excuse? Like he was trying to test their security system and that's his excuse for just wanting to steal this?
It could be, but he did have a pending application with Disney to become a security guard. So I'm assuming that he was going to try. They found him basically pushing a shopping cart around one of the Walt Disney World resorts. And they called the police because they said it looked a little suspicious. And the police found him wearing khakis and an orange work vest and a name tag, playing himself off as an employee. And he never actually removed anything from the property. He didn't just take the R2-D2 droid. He moved them around and hid them in the hopes that I think that maybe he could be like the hero that finds them. I don't know. I think that his plan's not going to work out very well for him.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to get the job.
No, I like Star Wars too. I mean, the R2-D2 droid is tempting, but I don't know. Not for a security job.
All right, Miranda, good stuff this week. Are you going to buy anything tax-free for Freedom Week in Florida?
I've actually been dying to buy a paddleboard, so I might actually go out there and save a good $20 on a paddleboard because they're not cheap. So, we'll see what I can save because I would like to get out there and enjoy the waterways this weekend too.
Nice.
So.
Thanks, Ron DeSantis. Thanks, Miranda. We'll see you next Friday.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
It's not even controversial anymore.
People know in Florida their freedoms are going to be respected.
All right, I told you we're going to start a new segment on Fridays. Fridays are all about segments. I want you to have predictability on Fridays. Go into Friday having a little fun, learning something new. There is a new segment I'm going to start, a weekly segment called Understanding America. And I thought, what better time to start it than around the 4th of July, the birth of our nation. My dad was really into history of all kinds, but American history. And the very first word he ever taught me to spell was Constitution. I would say my dad was a constitutionalist. And so it's something I learned about at a very early age and learning the amendments and all these important parts of our history. So I have this book. It's called I actually got it at Costco. It's called The U.S. Constitution and Other Writings. And it has a whole bunch of interesting stuff in here. It has famous speeches from history. It has, all the important paperwork and stuff like that, like oh gosh, I mean, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, George Washington's first inaugural address. Of course, it has all the constitutional amendments in it. And it just has a lot of really fascinating information that can help us better understand America and to talk about issues like the Constitution with some level of understanding and authority. And so what I'm going to do every Friday in our new segment, Understanding America, is to read one of these important documents from history, or at least read a portion of them to you. It'll be like story time with Brandi, but in a very a way that helps us learn and understand. So I thought, what better to launch this with than the Declaration of Independence. I mean, Independence Day coming up, it makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I'm going to read a big chunk of it to you. So grab your whatever drink you've got. It is Friday after all, and let me teach you a little bit about our country. So this is from the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. It goes on to lay out abuses that they say they've suffered under the King of Britain at the time. And then it ends with this. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That a passage from the Declaration of Independence on this 4th of July weekend, and we'll do this again next Friday with a different important writing from the history of this country. That's it for this episode of Undivided. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. If you have not become a subscriber already, please do so. We do a bonus episode just for subscribers every single Wednesday. You can do that at patreon.com/undivided or by becoming a contributor on my locals community, brandikruse.locals.com. Thank you to the founding sponsor of Undivided, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.